All right, so now we are moving into the Universal Service panel, and the conversation that we just heard was, I think, a good introduction to it. So as we know, the Universal Service Fund was originally intended to subsidize voice communications for rural and low-income consumers, and it's steadily transitioning to focus on broadband. In 2011, the high-cost fund became the Connect America Fund and began to subsidize rural broadband. And this year, the White House announced the Connect Ed program, which increased funding for the schools and libraries ERate program. And the FCC is currently considering how to reform the Lifeline program to subsidize broadband instead of voice for low-income people. And that was much of the discussion we just heard. Overall, the fund now collects and redistributes about $8 billion a year. And as we've discussed, the money comes from fees imposed on certain communication services. So both the distribution and collection mechanisms have been criticized as inefficient, and that's part of the discussions of the reforms. And so, we hope today to discuss some the questions of whether there's a way to meet these societal goals of providing some level of broadband service to everyone in ways that are both equitable and efficient. And so our panel will address these issues, and we have on this panel, introduce them in alphabetical order, James Assey, who is the Executive Vice President of the National Cable and Telecommunications Association, Commissioner Mignon Clyburn, who's obviously an FCC commissioner, and has a long history in utility regulation. And prior to her swearing in, she served as the representative of South Carolina's 6th District on the Public Service Commission of South Carolina, including several years as chair. Blair Levin is a non-resident senior fellow at the Brookings Institution, where he also serves as executive director of GIG-U. Greg Roston is Deputy Director and Senior Fellow at the Stanford Institute for Economic Policy Research and Director of the Public Policy Program, Professor of Economics by Courtesy at Stanford. And Brad Wimmer is Professor of Economics at the University of Nevada, Las Vegas, where his research focuses on the effects regulation and deregulation have on the market for telecommunications. Now, before we start, I want to, we'll ask questions at the end, and I'll also, like I did last time, I'll be following Twitter, and I will respond to some things that come up there. When I last moderated, somebody actually pointed out a mistake I'd made while I was speaking. That was actually really helpful. So I will be watching it. If you have something to say on Twitter, please say it. Now, I'd like to start with Commissioner Clyburn, to sort of expand on what she was talking about in her discussion with Commissioner O'Reilly, where you said that you want to think about the Universal Service Program more holistically. How to get sort of how to help the most people, right? And if you could, sort of expand on that, that would be great.
One of the things that I chuckle about is when people talk about my focus on Lifeline, they say Lifeline and Universal Service. And I said Lifeline is a part of Universal Service, and that's why it's so, I'm glad you really teed that question up, because I think it's important for us to look at the Universal Service Program, each program as one leg in a four-legged stool. You mentioned the high cost now Connect America program. The reason part of the push for reform is because the monies that were flowing to those companies were being used very explicitly, even though we didn't explicitly support it, to support broadband infrastructure. And so we said, because this is the wave of now and in the future, that we will be more explicit about that and will, affirm that in order to get money going forward, you will be required in a certain number of years to construct a framework that is in sync with the way the world is trending. The Lifeline program, we talked about that, ERate in the program to help connect healthcare facilities. All of those are important and should be looked at in concert, because if there's one thing in that mix that is out of whack, then I believe that the entire stool is at risk. If we don't have connectivity, particularly to the least of these, then those who are in need or receiving assistance from those healthcare facilities will not have the ability for a continuum of care. As great as we should be speaking about ERate and the President's Connect home initiative. From the E-rate perspective, schools close, libraries close. There should not be a continuum in terms of people being able to do their homework or to continue their educational and business experiences if they can't afford it, which is why Lifeline is so important. So I look at it holistically because, again, if we don't talk about not just the infrastructure build side, not just providing connectivity for rural healthcare clinics, not just ensuring, again, that schools and libraries have the state-of-the-art connectivity we need to be effective and forward-thinking learning centers. If there is not the ability for those most in need to be able to afford service, then we're going to have inefficiencies that will continue to manifest itself economically in a negative way on this society. So again, that's why I look at it as seamlessly as possible, because it's important for us to think about the adoption, affordability, the accessibility side of the equation, and not separate this.
So in the draft order, you've expressed interest in moving this to, I don't think you used the word voucher, but a system that is more focused on individuals rather than, so you said, for example, you don't have the companies certify them. Is that something that you would prefer to see more throughout the system?
I was pleased to speak with my colleague and those who are similarly calibrated, so to speak, for us to really discuss about how we bring ensure. We keep talking about contributions and the levels that are hovering around 17 point. I can't remember what it is this particular quarter, and what we can do to address that. The only way I know to do that is to be more efficient and to really go back to where we began in terms of rereading what the purpose of universal service, what the purpose of the funding construct is. And that is to bridge a communications divide. That is to be, for this to be a means or a conduit to provide service where the marketplace is not flowing. I think it's important for us to reread and revisit that and to continue to calibrate these programs to be reflected. And yes, I think the only way to either arrest or address the issues as it relates to contributions is to remind ourselves that we need to make sure the money is flowing where needed, because it is not doing that effectively. And I am, again, a proponent of looking at that and making the adjustments where necessary.
Okay. Brad, you and Greg are probably responsible for 3/4 of the economics literature on universal service. So let me ask, what's your take on sort of the overall effectiveness of the program so far, and especially I was thinking about your 2011 paper where you looked at Lifeline and LinkUp, and then if possible, what you think the lessons are from that research to how we would reform the system.
Okay. Well, I agree with the commissioner. The most important thing is to be more efficient. And so to be more efficient, what we have to look at is what are we getting for our money? What is being delivered? What are the outcomes? And so in the research that Greg and I have done, there's been a couple of things that come forward. And so this could help us design a program. The first thing is a lot of the money from the Lifeline program goes to households that would subscribe to telephone service, even if there were no subsidy. So, the question is, what do we want to accomplish? Do we want to try to transfer income from one group to another, or do we want to try to increase penetration rates? And I think that the bigger bang for your buck is to concentrate on the number of people who have access to the network. So that leads to kind of the second point, that low-income households have a very difficult time with upfront payments, which are probably going to be important when you're talking about the refurbished computers and these type of things. And so the commission got rid of the the link-up program, which is upfront funding. And I think there was a number of different issues with it that I think are being addressed in this next round of rulemaking to take care of the fraud and abuse. But moving money from reducing the monthly charge to moving it to the upfront will do two things. One, it addresses that issue of the ability to fund upfront payments. And two, it's better targeted because it would be targeted at people who don't have service. So we think that these moves could improve the efficiency of the system, reduce the costs, and then be able to reduce that contribution factor.
Scott, I'm sorry to be so rude so early, but that's me. I said hello, and that was the nicest. Yeah.
That was very nice.
Yeah. So I do not argue with what you said about the efficiencies. And I've got your paper right here. When it comes to the Link Up program, and respectfully, that's where a lot of the savings from our reforms came from. So full disclosure from that point. But I do take issue with what you said about, and my colleague and I have this conversation quite a bit about those who would be signed up for anyway. So, people want to communicate. All around the world, they're making incredible economic sacrifices to communicate. So I'm going to yield to you on that point. But should they be making the trade-offs that we know that they're making in order to communicate? And that's a question that I am proud to say that we're addressing and asking in this country. And then another series of facts that was released by Pew, it said that yes, you might be right there, but 44% of those who are low income, who have a smartphone, because of economic hardships, discontinue or disconnect their service over the course of the year. And those who rely on broadband only, mobile broadband connectivity, 48% of those are forced to shut off service, because of economic hardships. So yes, while they might sign up, almost 50% of them are disconnected because of hardship. So we need to look at, when we talk about data, look at it from that perspective as to if they sign up, do they stay signed up? And that's part of the conversation that I hope we will continue to have.
Well, first off, when I talk about it, I say move some of in terms of the weight, you might want more of the weight on the upfront charges, reducing the upfront charges, because that's where the difficulty is. Mm-hmm. They have difficulty funding those things. Then also there's evidence that you may need to reduce the thing. But what I worry about is it becomes just a straight income transfer program. Okay. Because when it's just a straight income transfer program, the FCC is not, and the way we collect the money is not the most efficient way to do that. Because raising $1 by increasing, a 15, 16, 17% tax costs more than $1. Right? So we're not just taking $1 from one group and giving $1 to the other group. We've got to collect the money, we've got the administration fees, then you get what we call in economics the deadweight loss, the inefficiencies, the fact that you're taxing things is going to change the way people behave. And so you want to impose costs on one group to try to help another group with a fairly narrow base. I think that there's other programs that are better suited for income transfers.
Sure.
Can I just offer an observation? Because whenever we talk about universal service, I find that there's something, a really big thing missing, which is we're talking about pennies and we should be talking about dollars. What I mean by that is, it is absolutely certain that at some point in the program, we're using money inefficiently. By the way, I've spent most of my life in the private sector. Private sector people do the same thing. It's very difficult to get everything, totally efficient. Mm. And furthermore, when you run a government program, you have to follow certain rules. Your due process requires a certain kind of economic inefficiency because you have to have rules that meet the median and not necessarily every individual case. So while I'm sympathetic to trying to be efficient, and certainly, by the way, I want to commend Scott for his great work on the National Broadband Plan, because there were a number of efficiencies in the program that other people have talked about that really came out of his work at that time. That's not the only thing. And the big thing that everybody misses is How much more efficient would government be if it knew that everybody was online and everyone was digitally ready? The savings to the government in terms of its own role as enterprise is in the billions and billions, if not tens of billions of dollars. There was a high-tech council study that talked about if governments just kind of totally switched to an IP platform, it's about $1 trillion of savings and operations over a 10-year period. Of course, not all of that is simply by getting everybody on. But my point is, and this is true at the federal level, at the state level, at the local level, if governments knew that everybody had connectivity in home, not only would the efficiency of government improve in terms of the effectiveness of being able to do its programs, but it would also save lots and lots of money. So whenever we talk about this, this is actually somewhat different with what we were talking about in terms of universal service in the telephone era, which was fundamentally about making sure that everybody had access to 911 and emergencies and things like that. This is actually about improving the kind of the commons for how we operate in an information age. And so while it's important to be as efficient as possible, let's not forget there's actually a huge upside to the country by getting everybody on and getting all the anchor institutions connected and all of that.
But I think there's a lot of money available to target in different ways if we concentrate on exactly that. Let's get people connected, and let's make that the goal, and let's make that the measuring stick and put programs in place that achieve that. So we've got a number of ways to do it.
So, okay.
Let me actually follow up on that. Greg, I know you want to try to help provide a structure here for us to think about this, but before we have any structure, I'd just rather ask a random question. Blair, so I mean, ERate was your baby at some point anyway.
I think other people claim it as their baby, but I would view it as, victory has 1,000 fathers and defeat is an orphan. I think it's an incredibly successful program, and therefore lots of people would claim that.
But it's always put together, schools and libraries, it's usually talked about under one rubric.
Yeah.
But they're different organizations.
Yes.
Is it right that they're lumped together, especially given what you just said about the importance of getting everybody connected to the government in some way? Libraries are an important place of connection for poor people, and which is a little bit different from schools. Should these be part of the same program? I mean, do they really have the similar objectives? Should we be looking at them the same way?
Well, I go back to what Commissioner Clyburn said. The universal service basically is kind of trying to solve three separate problems, but they need to be solved similarly. One is a problem of what we think of as high-cost areas. Put that aside for right now. A second is a problem of anchor institutions. And by the way, also part of ERate is the rural healthcare facilities. It's funded a little bit differently, but it's kind of part of the same bucket. And then the third is low-income individuals, or in something we don't talk about, for example, but it's also in universal services, hard of hearing individuals. And so those are kind of three buckets. And in that sense, I think it's perfectly fine to put it together. It might be that you could more efficiently do it if you broke out the programs, but I don't think so. At least I haven't seen compelling evidence of that, but I could be wrong about that. But again, I think there were certain moments in time where you want to debate certain issues, and Scott, I don't see that issue as being timely. Let me quickly point out that in the previous panel, the commissioners were arguing about a cap and a budget. That's a really important debate in 2017. It's not a really important debate in 2015. The important debate, in my opinion, is how do we create a platform for Lifeline that allows people in 2017 to right size the program. And the reason I say that is the electorate will decide the right size of the program. That's just a practical reality. This commission will, in approximately end of this year or in January, decide how to reform it, and I'm completely on the side of Commissioner Clyburn in terms of taking the certification away from the carriers, moving to a benefits card, the things that she outlined in her AEI speech. But once you do that, then but the budget doesn't really go into effect until the program changes are done, and that's not going to be done until after the election. So I would hope that we could actually put aside for now the discussion of budgets and what I think of as right-sizing the program, but really focus on how do we have an efficient program that serves consumers, serves carriers, helps eliminate waste, fraud, and abuse, and serves the needs of the program, and really helps drive the funds to the people who need it.
Actually, I think that's a good lead into what Greg was going to talk, at least from what I read over his shoulder as he was scribbling things down. But sort of thinking about at least an economic framework of how we should address these issues.
So Scott was afraid that Brad and I, having been co-authors on so much, would say a lot of the same things, and I think it's a good fear. So in terms of bedrock economic principles for a universal service program, that if we have a subsidy, there should be a goal. And what the goal is, I think a lot of it, no one's going to say it should be an income transfer program, but that's what it really has been, a very effective income transfer program. Lifeline is going to low-income people, but rural is going from urban to rural people who don't necessarily need a subsidy. And this is, I remember when I was at the commission, Ted Turner brought a ranch in New Mexico, 3/4 the size of the state of Rhode Island. And presumably he was getting rural universal service subsidies. It's not the kind of thing that we should be thinking about. So I was very encouraged this morning to hear the two commissioners talk about having sort of more of a target, that this is trying to increase penetration and trying to eliminate the idea of it being an income transfer program to people who don't need it, for sure. Once you have a goal, the idea is let's minimize the cost of spending. We want to target this. That's part of that. The idea of a $10 million income limit seems a little high to me. Just even though I am in Silicon Valley, that's still high. The Affordable Care Act gives subsidies for people up to 400% of the poverty level. That might be, at least, I think a lot of people were upset that that was kind of high, but at least you can think that there are income limits on programs and also the so subsidies and that. And then you want to minimize the cost of raising the money. So there, as Brad talked about, distortions from taxes. What you want to have as an economist is you want to have a broad-based, public finance teaches you, the way to minimize these distortions is to have a broad-based tax. So economists would say we should fund this out of general revenues, general government revenues, rather than a tax in the communication sector or a tax on broadband or whatever. You want to do it as broad-based as possible that would minimize your distortions. And the other thing that public finance economics teaches you is Ramsey pricing. You want to try and tax something that's very inelastically demanded. When Congress said we shouldn't tax broadband, well, that was when broadband wasn't inelastically demanded. Now, I think it's probably more inelastically demanded, so you might want to think about that. Same with wireless. These things are relatively inelastically demanded now, although we need to get better estimates as to what they are to think about that. What this overall says to me is, and as Blair said, we're talking about cents, not dollars. I thought, the Lifeline program that's getting so much heat is 1/3 the cost of the rural broadband program or the rural subsidies. Why not try and think about where it is? And the Lifeline program transfers income to people who need it, as opposed to the rural program, which costs 3 times as much, that transfers a lot of money, as our research shows, to people who don't need it. And it taxes people who are in urban areas who often are poor. So I do have compliments to the commissioners about their ideas of trying to improve this and to try to have a program that's more targeted. It seems to me that the logical conclusion of this is to try to institute a voucher program based on income. And then you have the low-income rural people would get subsidies, and firms would have an incentive to serve them. Commissioner Clyburn talked about competition and choice. Vouchers give people the incentive to try to serve these areas because they know that their customers are going to have the vouchers to provide them if they're low income, and they'll have the money to provide it if they're not low income, or to pay for it. So that's an important thing. But choice is also important. One of the things I noticed, how many of you are staying in this hotel and signed up for Wi-Fi in your room? Can you raise your hands? Okay, now keep your hand up for a sec. Keep your hands up. Now, keep your hand up, look around and see, there are probably 15 people who have their hands up. How many of you actually picked the premium service? Okay, 3, 2, 1. No, there's 3 or so. Most of you didn't. You had a choice. You could pick a 5 megabits a second service or a 10 megabits a second service. And as I was warned this morning, this is not a representative sample.
That's true. These are all people whose expenses are going to be reimbursed.
Expenses are going to be reimbursed, and they value technology, or at the Technology Policy Institute. You value technology and connectedness and that sort of thing. And almost none of you picked the premium service. of 10 megabits a second. The FCC is defining broadband at 25 megabits a second. So it seems to me that a voucher is also something that should give people choice. Would you rather have 5 or 10 megabits a second mobile broadband or 25 megabits a second fixed broadband? The FCC is saying it should be 25 megabits a second fixed broadband, but it seems like competition and choice should allow consumers to have the power to push what kinds of services they want.
Okay, Scott, can I just? I agree with a lot of what Greg said, particularly about the rural areas, but I find myself in the odd position of actually defending rural phone companies in this regard.
We're going to have to cut your mic off.
Yeah, right. Because those who know me know that I've spent a lot more time debating them. But I think you're pointing out something that is actually very problematic. I have no problem with vouchers, particularly on Lifeline. But part of the problem of universal service in the high cost areas is and it's similar in ERate, is we are trying to fund what is fundamentally a capital project, but we keep mixing up CapEx and OpEx. And so actually, I think the most efficient way to do universal service would be you take all the money that we're doing now, actually you could probably take half of the money and accomplish more. You basically allow the FCC to float a bond, you get a capital, you raise, I think, order of magnitude $100 billion over 20 years or something like that, because it's whatever. And then you have a reverse auction and you just get fiber everywhere. You kind of have a reverse auction for the hardest places to get, and you see how far you get. And then you end the program because the CapEx is paid for. Now there are certain problems with that, but the problem of having vouchers in low income areas is you can't rely on that over a long stream of time to essentially upfront put the fiber or put whatever facilities you need to go in there. And so I just think that as we focus on that, as opposed to Lifeline, which is fundamentally giving people the opportunity to buy networks that are already in place. And so there are problems with that. I certainly agree that economically it'd be better to have it be out of the tax base, but I also have to say that rural phone companies could not finance the construction of companies if they said, don't worry, Congress will fund this every year. Whereas the FCC and the Universal Service Fund is seen as consistent enough that they can get various financing. So I think that part of the challenge for universal service is we're essentially funding it on an operating basis, but we are funding what is mostly a capital cost. And there are certain inefficiencies in that, but it's really challenging in terms of the practical political realities. And let me just close by saying that I also agree with you on contribution reform. I think it's very tough politically. It was very unfortunate, and people keep forgetting this. In 2008, Kevin Martin had a plan to do it with phone numbers. I'm not sure that's the best plan, but at that time it was better than what we have now, and phone numbers have grown. It would have been nice to do that. Commissioner McDowell killed it, and then spent the next 5 or 7 years that he was on the commission complaining about the fact that we hadn't had contribution reform. And I think that was an unfortunate point, but it points out the political difficulty of changing that system.
Before we move on from rural, if we do at all, this is a good place, I think, for James to talk about the another effect of rural universal service, which there's potential competitive effects, representing the companies that basically don't get any of those subsidies.
Yeah, no, and thank you, Scott. I found myself listening to Greg and trying to write down as quickly as I could the notes of his outline because it was so good. The problem, obviously, I think if we were all working off a blank sheet of paper, that's what we would work off of. The problem is we're not on a blank sheet of paper, and how do we get from the world where universal service was essentially a compact with a monopoly to fund the goals that we all share today with a recognition of the competitive marketplace we live in today. And the fact of the matter is that the cable industry in particular, we've built out to 93% of all households in America, largely without any government financing. DOCSIS speeds are hitting a gigabit, and the next generation will have multi-gigabit speeds. So, and we're competing in the marketplace oftentimes with people who are receiving government subsidies. And it just seems to me that, while I think there are some signs that we are recognizing the competitive world that we're living in, the glacial pace of our progress is something that is frustrating for an industry that continues to put private capital into building and improving its own network. So, I do want to commend Commissioner Clyburn, Commissioner O'Reilly for the work they recently did in noting that we probably don't need to subsidize rural carriers who are covered by a competitor who reaches 100% of the homes in that area without any type of subsidy. But that is the tip of the iceberg when it comes to recognizing the distortions that can play into the current regime. So the more that we can do to recognize the and unleash the power of private investment and to steer scarce government funds into the areas where you don't have a competitive alternative, I think we need to do. And I fear that we're moving too slow on a lot of these areas, and we have areas with price cap carriers that have rights of first refusal to build DSL to over 6 years. It's not even broadband today, from what I read. So we need to take a more sobering assessment of how we promote efficiency in the system and to really redouble our efforts in that regard.
Let me ask a question that's really unfair, that you probably can't answer, but it flows from Greg's comment, so it's his fault. You could imagine a scenario where we have means-tested vouchers for people, for low-income people, to apply to any carrier they want, which would include potentially cable broadband, but that we also tax broadband because it's an inelastic service. Is that a complete non-starter? And should it be?
You're talking on the contribution side?
Yeah, exactly.
I won't say it's. I would certainly say it's not a preferred outcome at this point. Certainly because at the time that we want to promote broadband adoption, why do we want to impose additional costs on people's broadband bills? But I think all of us kind of recognize that these programs change over time, and it's certainly a conversation that we want to be a part of. I do think on the actual subsidy side, one of the things that our industry has done a lot of work on, Comcast probably at the lead of the pack with their own adoption programs, but certainly Cox, Suddenlink, other carriers that have partnered with other groups such as Connect to Compete and other nonprofits, is to really try and work outside of the idea of a government program, because one of the things that we often focus on the cost, because I think policymakers feel that's the one thing that they can control, but I think all the research shows us that is really only one factor in the adoption conundrum, and it's probably not even the most important factor when you're talking about issues like, is it relevant to my daily life? What is the cost of the computer? That sort of thing. So, I think for these programs to really be successful, they need to, focus on kind of a holistic approach to getting people to connect, to showing that there is value in the broadband connection, and to really, moving the needle in that regard. I think it also, to the extent, and I think the order on Lifeline and LinkUp tees this up, and it's just, long overdue, we have to get more participation. And we have these, regulatory barnacles of requirements like you have to be an eligible telecommunications carrier that really make no sense, to me at least, in this modern age. And I'm glad to see that the Commission recognizes the potential obstacles that can create and is looking at ways to kind of streamline that process. And the last point, in addition to participation, is that we have to be fiscally prudent. I wasn't sure when Blair was talking about the idea of a cap or a budget, whether he was saying we should fight about it or we shouldn't fight about it.
We should fight about it later.
We should fight about it later.
Yes.
Yeah, and that was when I was a kid, I always wanted dessert first, and then I'd tell my mom I'll fight about the spinach later. So I always am a little worried. And I do think that one of the things that it is always a disciplining factor. If we try to operate in a budget, it forces us to be more efficient in the choices we make. And so I would rather have that debate sooner rather than later.
But let me just illustrate, if I could just illustrate the point very quickly. I think it's really important we create a platform that allows the consumers of Lifeline to also know what other subsidies might be available to them, like Internet Essentials or training programs or device subsidies or things like that. That's part of creating the platform. We don't have that today. I think that's the job of the FCC today. My only point about the budget, that's a very legitimate debate. I'm just saying we're going to spend a huge amount of political capital in 2015 on an issue where it will be revisited in 2017, and hopefully by then we have a platform that actually gives us some data that allow us to right-size the program in a better way. So it's just about how do you allocate political capital, which is as important as financial capital.
Mm-hmm.
So to further, enlarge the target on my back that I'm about to, make more visible. The fact of the matter is, under the current universal service construct, we are subsidizing broadband-enabled networks. And so when you talk about, what I think should be an adult, I keep using that word, part of the conversation, debate, we need to talk about, what that means and whether or not that pie should be broadened in line or in sync with where the money is flowing anyway, disproportionately, those who are least benefiting are paying the most. And that part of it, I don't think is enough of the part of the conversation that I don't think we're having that conversation much beyond sort of academic exchanges, and I think that's unfortunate.
I think an academic wants to say something about that.
So just to follow up on a couple of these comments, one of the things is to structure, following the economic principles, to structure a system where you can actually have cable and wireless be competitors. The system was set up with, as you said, for a monopoly provider. We want to have it be set for competitors. In terms of a broadband tax, I said inelastically demanded. One thing I neglected to mention was that that there are lots of different tiers of broadband service. So that you might cause somebody not to, broadband connection might be inelastic, but the decision to pick on 10 or 25 or 50 megabits a second might change based on that. There's the elasticity between services might be affected by a tax. And then the final thing I want to talk about was price discrimination. Economists think that this can be a good thing or a bad thing. It sounds pejoratively bad, but one of the things that I think the low-income programs that have been these voluntary conditions, in quotes, of mergers have been to provide low-income broadband service. In essence, this to me is a price discrimination tool, that the broadband providers are able to charge a lower price to people who might not otherwise sign up. And this, if indeed that's the way it's working, this is actually a good thing. Where there's price discrimination, you charge a lower price to people who wouldn't otherwise sign up. You get them and you increase quantity, and that's sort of the definition of how economists look at price discrimination is increasing quantity. And this is a very efficient way of providing low-income services, sort of almost to make it politically good, not just politically acceptable, but politically good for a company to price discriminate.
So I wasn't sure where you were headed with that, since if you were to do, I can't think of what it is right now, but if they were to take samples of fingerprints that are on some of those voluntary agreements, you might find my fingerprints somewhere.
That's good.
Yeah.
So.
I think it's great.
Brett?
These programs are there.
Just one thing back to yesterday's conversation is, Howard Slansky said the one thing about the act is it allowed competition to enter. So what the competition did is it before the Telecom Act, the prices that we had didn't make a whole lot of sense. All kinds of different cross subsidies, 25 cent a minute long distance, all these other things. And what competition did is it forced all those prices to get rationalized, and prices have moved to cost. The high cost fund kind of impedes that whole process. And one thing that there's really, I think, the benefits in terms of incentives for investment and other things in the high cost areas is where people could come up with new ideas and new techniques to try to serve these people. And I worry that the rules and the way they're being put in place is not allowing that innovation and prices to work to try to provide service that will bring lower price, higher quality service to people in low cost areas, or high cost areas rather.
Before, I wanted to ask about some of the innovations the FCC has done, like implementing reverse auctions. But before I do that, I wanted to ask Blair. You mentioned or maybe it was James, the importance of non-governmental programs. Yeah, it was James mentioned the importance of non-governmental programs as well, private sector programs. And Blair, that's sort of what you've been involved in for
Yes.
a few years now, in trying to bring new broadband networks. Now, maybe the communities that you were involved with are too different from unserved, university communities, which probably have a fairly high willingness to pay for broadband. But are there lessons that you learned from trying to bring in new networks that might be useful in a universal service context?
Yes, because at the end of the day, what we're trying to do is fill in a big puzzle. And there are lots of different pieces of that puzzle. And the way we looked at filling in that puzzle in 1913 when we did the Kingsbury Commitment was very different than we looked at it in 1984 when we deregulated cable, or 92 when we regulated cable, or 96. And these things keep changing. And so how you solve this big puzzle of getting everybody, positioning them to be a viable citizen in the information economy is totally different. What Gig.U was all about was trying to explore experimentation in driving high bandwidth networks. Affordable, abundant bandwidth was kind of the mantra that we kept on. But what's interesting about that is the way in which you see experimentation going on that I think is really good. We're actually running a very interesting natural experiment that people haven't recognized. Some of James' companies are doing things like Internet Essentials, trying to get people on. It's too early to know how effective it is, but I will say one of the things that's impressive is that Comcast has adjusted as they've seen data, and they adjust more rapidly than government, which is great. We also see in Kansas City and in other places where Google is doing a completely different experiment. Instead of doing the price discrimination, which, like Greg, I completely support, they're simply saying we'll have a general offering that is basically free on a month-by-month. You just pay $300 for a kind of a one-time connection fee, but you can do that over time. I don't know which one will work better, but I think it's really great. But at the end of the day, this is the part that I think is really important. We need to run a bunch of experiments. And by the way, the FCC is also running some in high-cost areas, which I think is really good. But at the end of the day, this is really the government's obligation, because this is kind of part of the commons of our time. And so while we can get maybe from 93% to 95%, by the way, we aren't going to get to 100%, but we want to get in that kind of 96, 98% of getting everybody on. And I think the notion of running a bunch of experiments at a certain point in time and then figuring out how to most efficiently get to the finish line is something that's very important. And what Gig.U was about, as is Google Fiber, is how do we look at existing assets, lower the cost of deploying on top of them, lower the operating costs, increase revenues in certain ways to change the math of upgrades or new entrants.
And I think that experimentation also is important and should be, it's a bit risky for a regulator to talk about experiments because when we've got them, and then when the results are not necessarily in sync with certain expectations, then there's a headline or two or three or four. But those are risks that I think we need to increasingly be willing to take. And this was one of the reasons why, again, if you do the forensics, you might see my fingerprints in a couple of places. To encourage the private sector to have different experiments of their own. I don't want Internet Essentials to look like what AT&T is doing, to look like what another because again we learn from all of those, and we all know in this ecosystem. One size fits all, does not lift up, or So these are important, and I think are very necessary to achieve the 95, whatever the sweet spot is, at least 95% penetration.
Okay.
So I was just, Blair, you just brought up the Google model of financing. They charge the companies, and this goes right to your earlier point about OpEx versus CapEx, right? Why can't a rural carrier go in and say, okay, we'll serve this area, but we'll make a commitment that you have to pay us over time, and maybe it's a lien on the property. There are other ways of financing this than ongoing big government grants.
No, and look, I mean, if you had a voucher where you had a voucher, but you had to commit to some period of time, maybe that would work. I mean, there are a variety of different ways of doing it. Another way of doing it, that at some point some economist will evaluate the following. Would we as a country be better off if our US simply said, we will forgive all loans to rural phone companies in exchange for a commitment to not take any universal service? Because the subsidies are essentially coming out of the same folks, taxpayers, consumers, but it's basically most of the country. I do think that there are a variety of ways of addressing it, and that might be one. But that's part of what the problem is the confusion between CapEx and OpEx.
So, I mean, the FCC actually has been doing a fair amount of experimenting lately. And they showed that it's possible to do a reverse auction with its mobility fund, and which people had argued with for a long time. And then there was a whole series of pilots. And does anybody have any comments on those, on whether we can draw any conclusions from the series of pilots that the FCC did?
I think on the reverse auctions, where they've been trying to reduce the cost of serving high-cost areas, it was important. The FCC and Brad worked a lot on the original cost models, where the FCC figured out what does it cost to serve this area. Well, when they ran reverse auctions, the results turned out to be about half the cost of these cost models. So that sort of showed that we need to have some real-world experience in pushing down, giving people incentives to push down the cost of the subsidies. So I commend the FCC a lot for moving towards a more market-oriented solution to use the power of people's incentives to try to do that. That was a great innovation. One of the things that there was a group of 71 concerned economists, I think Scott was part of this, that as part of the stimulus package, NTIA and RUS had made huge infrastructure grants, $4.7 billion. And in our submission, we said, what you need to do is to select these on how cost effective they are. How many people, dollars per person signed up, per person passed or per person signed up. And the NTIA and RUS kind of looked at us and go, that's really nice, and we're going to go and do it the way we always do it and pick the best one because we can evaluate these.
I don't think they even said it looked really nice.
Anyway, I was actually asked to be on one of these selection committees, and I looked at the stuff and go, I have no skill and ability to pick the best project other than ranking it by that, but you're only giving me 2 projects, so I can't really evaluate it. So I declined to evaluate. But they ended up doing this, and there's been a bunch of controversy over the programs, and they haven't connected that many people relative to what they could have done. The FCC now is doing it based on dollars per connection or proposed connection. And I think that's a much, much better way of doing it, trying to figure out how do you be more cost effective. As an economist, I don't care if you want to try and connect more people, whether that person's in Texas or Alabama, I don't care. It's connecting a person. And that to me says that's what you're trying to do is connect Americans. Well, you want to be as cost effective as you can and use your budget as effectively as you can to connect the most people. Do it in an efficient way. And I think the FCC is making progress in this, and I think that's really good.
Again, that comes with, as I mentioned earlier, with levels of PR risk, which is probably
Absolutely.
why you see some people, wanting to stay within a known and quote unquote measurable framework. And that's part, I think, of what outside forces could help us with, because we will never get close to nirvana by doing things the same way that work marginally. So I really will continue to push, even if again that target grows.
Okay. There's actually an interesting difference between, because I was involved in both of these things. The part of the problem with RUS in transition was they had to do things that were timely, targeted, and temporary, and so they had to move very, very rapidly, and so they kind of fall into the things that they know. The part of the changes at the FCC reflect that we were able to step back with the plan and with the help of folks like Scott and you and others, actually build political capital, build an understanding of why reverse auctions would be better. And part of the beauty of the plan, and this isn't about our plan, this is about a planning process. Part of the beauty of it is you actually get to step back and look 5 to 10 years out, and then build political capital toward a more rational system. But when it's like when you're in there with the alligators, you're just wrestling with the alligators. You're not thinking about draining the swamp. And so part of the political challenge that I've really seen in my 2 stints in the federal government is how do you actually think long term when the pressures are all very short term?
Yeah, absolutely.
The only thing I'd add maybe to what Blair said is, despite the pressures maybe that RUS is under, I think this is in part an agency where we've seen continuing problems over time, and that's not to denigrate the people who do great work and are very diligent, but it really goes to underscore the problem of essentially in a competitive space deciding that you're going to provide a loan to one party and not another. So we continually have these issues where we're just, not only are we loaning to one carrier over another, but that essentially is going to prevent us from incenting more capital into that area because we're going to protect the loan value, and then there's this vicious cycle that goes on between RUS and USF. So I think if there's one thing that we really ought to redouble our efforts on, it's trying to impose some discipline on RUS to really try and get out of the business of trying to subsidize competition.
Brad.
Yeah, I just want to talk a little bit about the random trials that they did in terms of Lifeline. I mean, if you take a look, you talk about the policy and the way the press looks at it. I mean, if you look at the education literature, randomized trials is the state of the art. All the policies, they look at randomized trials and they try to see what works, what doesn't work. Development economies. I mean, randomized trials is kind of the cutting edge of where we are. And the FCC, I want to, having the randomized trials was a great idea. I haven't seen anybody analyze the data at this time. I've looked for some things. I read kind of summaries of them. You got to make sure that you do these things correctly. There's real, and people know how to do these things. I think what we could do is, our discussion earlier about should we have more upfront fees or reducing costs over time. What are the trade-offs? How can we find that out? Let's do some randomized trials. Let's get some estimates of what's going on. I mean, the goal is when we talk about efficiency, we want to maximize the number of people we can get on the network, or you could do it one of 2 ways, right? Maximize per dollar, or minimize cost to achieve a certain goal. But using these randomized trials, I think, shows the FCC is willing to look at data and wants to minimize the cost, and has in their mind that they understand that there's distortions that are caused by taxing or using these subsidies, and they want to do it the right way. Because it's really important we get it right. I mean, you've talked about the homework gap and all these other things. You want to address that, let's find the best way to do it.
And let's go to questions. I know Drew Clark has a question here. And while the microphone is coming, the point that the commissioner made about these pilots creating a bigger target is right. And it's important for people to recognize that we want these pilots. But if every single pilot showed success, then that would mean that they weren't actually taking enough risk in trying the program. So
please continue to say that. Thank you.
Drew.
Hi, Drew Clark, Broadband Breakfast. So I'd really like to come back to the point Blair's mentioned twice, and I don't think others have taken the bait, on the CapEx versus OpEx. And this, there's been a great discussion of flexibility and auctions and lots of creativity on both sides, on both infrastructure and the kind of month-to-month getting users online. But I really want to get some other answers to how would you do this? How would you design, say, half of the USF for operating expenses and half for capital expenses? What would be the things that Commissioner Clyburn, you'd have to do the commission would have to do to get this done? What do the economists think of this? Because I think this is fundamental, because we are dealing with the recurring costs as well as how we get these broader fiber infrastructures built.
So I think this is something that is, capital expenditures and operating expenditures that are really important. But this is something that companies in the marketplace do every single day.
Yeah.
And they put up, whether it's making iPhones or doing all sorts of things, they make these decisions and they take the risk, they invest, and they expect future revenue streams to cover their capital expenditures. And I think that's exactly the kind of thing that we want to try to push towards, rather than saying, this company, that's the wireline telephone company, gets the capital expenditure funded, and the wireless company and the cable company don't. That seems to me to be a silly thing, is have them take the risk knowing that they have a risky revenue stream. Some people will pay a lot of money and they don't, it doesn't have to be the case that rural people pay the same $45 a month that urban people pay for broadband. They might pay $60 a month but get a subsidy for low-income people. There are higher costs of serving rural areas are part of the cost of living in rural areas, to be honest. They pay, as Roger Knoll left, but he's talked for 20 years about the fact that he's happy to subsidize rural people if they subsidize his property taxes in Palo Alto. I'd be happy to too. There are trade-offs. Some things are cheaper in rural areas. Some things are more expensive. But the main thing on capital expenditures is companies do this every single day and make these risks and these trade-offs. So I think that's an important piece to think about.
There's a question here, Bob.
Well, it's a good discussion. I'm glad to see that Greg and Brad are still hard at work on this issue despite the resistance of the politics of the situation. Simply shifting from operating costs to capital costs, to subsidize capital expenditures isn't going to solve Commissioner Clyburn's problem. My guess is in New Mexico, Ted Turner's ranch will just get faster broadband from this. What you want is the capital expenditure should be targeted to underserved or unserved areas. But the other, there's very little evidence that the high-cost rural subsidies have had any effect on penetration or rates over many, many years of research, unless there's something I haven't seen recently. In addition, Blair and Scott agreed that the ERate program had been rather successful. I'm not sure that Brad and Greg would agree, but I don't know of any empirical evidence on them after the Austin Goolsbee study, which said that while they marginally transferred the cost of communications and expanding communications in the school from the property taxpayer in local areas to the communications taxpayer at the federal level, any evidence that they've had any effect on education. Is there anything? Has there been any studies done to justify spending and even expanding this program to schools, libraries, et cetera?
I did a little research, and I found the Goolsbee study. I think I found a paper in the NBER series by Ward, I think, and they looked at Texas. Mm-hmm. But I was, like you, didn't find a whole lot in terms of studies that have looked at these things. There's a lot of studies that talk about different computer-assisted learning and different things that I think could be informative and could be used to try to design a program that could be effective.
By what criterion are they a success?
Well, first of all, I think it was successful in that we did achieve what Congress actually asked us to do in 1996, which was to make sure that there was not inequality in terms of high-income areas having classrooms connected and low-income areas not. By the way, in the early phase, I'm not sure that'll be true of the reform of the E-rate, but there certainly were studies that suggested that the E-rate in the years 97 through 2002, I think, actually helped drive an upgrade to broadband in those areas where you had E-rate funding. It was kind of an anchor institution that drove greater connectivity. Look, I appreciate that. I think that if you look at the weight of all the evidence that came in from various groups, and you can say that they're certainly biased, the support for reform of the program to be more fiber and to have Wi-Fi, and that we needed to extend the program. There's an awful lot of anecdotal evidence. I agree with you, there isn't, but I think this gets us to the realm that you get a much broader economic debate, and it goes to Solo's paradox that we see productivity everywhere in the economy except in the statistics. And I would just say that when you talk to educators, and I feel very sensitive about this because my sister is a school teacher, and she has kind of been my conscience on this issue for a long time, pointing out that they were facing the problem as a school teacher. It is obvious that you assign, back in 2003 or 4, you assign homework based on materials that are only available on the web. What do you do when the number is 30% are connected? Well, you don't do it, but then at 60%, do you do it? Let me ask you this. How would you feel when, like, all the classrooms are connected, sending your kids to a school that weren't connected? The school systems that have choice in terms of having a lot of money, they're all really connected. And that's very high level. That tells you something. I also think you're starting to see things like Khan Academy and other kinds of programs that, very much like Solo, we're going to look backwards and be able to see where it came, but we really don't know how to measure it yet.
I think we have time for one more question. Oh, Peter.
Should private companies, cable and telephone companies, have a lot more discretion to introduce different tiers of service to price discriminate to expand output? Should they be able to trial it? I recall one cable company that proposed to do it in 4 cities a few years back, and it was quite an uproar over it.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think to Greg's point about price discrimination, I mean, the goal in mind is to try and figure out what is the strategy we can do to get people connected to the network, if I understand your question. And I think those types of experimentation are exactly what needs to happen in the marketplace.
And I could be wrong. I thought one of the 14, whatever the number is, experiments did have some tiering. I thought I remember reading that one did, but subject to check, as you lawyers like to say.
Okay, good. Well, thank you all for, oh, wait, Brad.
I was just going to say, yeah, she's correct.
There was a
They
tier.
had different levels and looked at different options
And basically, there was also, the cable companies and wireless companies do have different tiers already. So that's a pretty much easy answer, I think.
Well, thank you very much to the panelists, and especially Commissioner Claiborne for basically going for 2 hours straight this morning.